Gary Stevenson of Gary's Economics is going absolutely viral right now, and a lot of it has to do with this debate that he participated in on the Diary of a CEO podcast. In it, he debates with Daniel Priestley, who is an Australian serial entrepreneur, on the core issue that is facing the UK economy. What they agree on is that wealth inequality is increasing at a rapid rate, but where they disagree is on the solution. I want to be clear, I do not enjoy making this video. I am a huge supporter of creators that are going independent and creating YouTube channels to give a voice to the people and aren't going through the traditional media channels. That's what Wealth Potion is at the end of the day, and I hope I empower some of you to do the same with your own media brands. There's one big problem though, which is why I'm making this video, and that is that Gary's Economics is based on a flawed economic model of the world. And that's what I want to talk about today. Before we get into exactly what's wrong with Gary's Economics, I want to give him his flowers. There's a lot that he gets right. Firstly, as I mentioned, he is creating his own brand and voice on the internet, and his popularity really speaks for itself. He's amassed over 1 million subscribers on YouTube and gosh knows how many across all of his social media platforms, and I think this speaks to a very core truth that he is hitting on. He is speaking directly to the hearts of what a lot of British people are feeling right now. And although Gary's Economics focuses on the UK economy and this debate was about the UK economy, a lot of this stuff applies to the Western world at large, be it Canada, United States, Europe, Australia, even bits and pieces to South Korea, which is where I am today. And the core truth that he hits on is quite simple. Wealth inequality is increasing. The top 1% is getting richer and richer and richer every single year, but the average person does not feel like they're getting richer. In fact, living standards seem to be stagnant in most G7 countries, and some data is suggesting that they could start falling. Living standards could start falling in 2025, which is bonkers to really think about. And that's why I don't think it's a coincidence that Gary's YouTube channel is blowing up right now. He is speaking directly to a feeling that a lot of people sense, but they can't really put words to. In a very similar way that Donald Trump has given a voice to a lot of Americans that felt like they weren't being heard. So that's the first piece. I really admire what Gary's doing with his YouTube channel and how he's trying to give a voice to people that don't have a voice. I also agree with him on the problem that he's identified, and so did Daniel in this debate. Wealth inequality is increasing. But that's the first thing I want to break down for a moment, because in many of Gary's videos, he talks about how wealth inequality necessarily means that the poor are getting poorer. And that's just simply not the case. Because if you look at how modern economies have developed, yes, of course, wealth inequality has grown. Over the past 100 years, couple hundred years, it doesn't really matter what time span you look at. As economies grow wealth overall, wealth disparity, wealth inequality will also divide. And herein lies the first problem I have with Gary's argument, which is going to be a very unpopular statement, but I'm going to say it anyways. Not all wealth inequality is bad. Let me explain before you click away from the video. Wealth inequality describes the difference between the poor people in the economy and the rich people in the economy. I think most people would agree you don't want that to be too big. However, let's imagine two separate economies. Let's imagine one economy where everybody has $1,000. And then let's imagine another economy where the rich people have $1 million and the poor people have $10,000. Now, the first economy has zero wealth inequality. Everybody has the exact same amount of money. In the second economy, there is massive wealth inequality. The rich have $1 million, that's 100 times more than the poor people. But I think everyone would agree in these two obviously very extreme examples, the second economy is better because more people have more wealth. Even the poorest people have $10,000, which is 10 times more money than in the first economy. And so I use this exaggerated example to point out that, again, if you look at the data, in most modern developed nations, as wealth inequality increases, that has created gains for the entire economy. Gary loves to talk about the mid-1900s, the boomers, your parents, your grandparents, how they were able to work as a teacher or a firefighter or a factory worker, and they could build their wealth on a pretty normal wage, and how those golden years have been lost, and that nowadays people that are working those jobs are struggling to make ends meet. Everything in that statement is correct, but what he misses is that what created the environment for that to even be possible was a ton of wealth inequality. The rich getting richer created a vibrant economy that employed people, that allowed for the average middle-class people like you and I to make a living. And that is the era that our parents and grandparents lived in. I know I provided a very extreme hypothetical example here, but a very real example of this is South Korea. I live in South Korea, as many of you know, and right across the border, less than 100 kilometers away from where I'm sitting right now, is a demilitarized zone, and then North Korea, which is the same ethnic people, but a country that took a very different economic path. They pursued communism and socialism. And look, I know that this is an extreme. I know Gary is not suggesting we should all become communist or socialist, but it's to demonstrate a point that by simply changing the core fundamentals of the economy, by valuing pure wealth equality at the expense of wealth in general, you will most oftentimes get a much poorer economy and a much poorer people. And that is the alarm bell that a lot of people are ringing. And while North Korea is, again, an extreme example, I am sure there is someone in your social circle that has a relative or a friend that escaped the Soviet Union. Just speak with people that come from Eastern Europe, and they will tell you the stories from their parents and grandparents, how the Soviet Union, which was perhaps the biggest, most successful experiment with socialism, completely collapsed under the weight of its own success. And that was largely because when you try to redistribute wealth at such a massive scale, the economy simply cannot function properly and it falls apart. Now, I know some of you are going to disagree with that politically. My goal here is not to talk about the politics of socialism versus capitalism. That's for another video. What I really want to speak to is the specific solution that Gary proposes in many of his videos on YouTube, but most importantly within this debate with Daniel. He says to Dan and to the host Stephen Bartlett that the solution is a wealth tax, a tax on wealth above some certain threshold. So as an example, I think this is the example they use in the debate, but if you have over $1 million, you would get taxed on any of your wealth above that amount, say 1% or 3%. He uses some of those numbers, by the way, in the debate. The problem with a wealth tax is not hypothetical. It is real. There are many countries in the world that have tried wealth taxes and then scrapped them because of how ineffective and expensive they are. And that's what I think is, quite frankly, so dangerous about Gary's economics, is that 80, maybe 90% of what he says makes total sense. It sounds like he's speaking directly to you and he understands the challenges that you're going through in your life. And then that last 10% is there's a simple solution. We just have to tax the rich more. And the problem is actually achieving that. Why did all these countries drop their wealth tax? Well, because one, a bunch of wealthy people left these countries. That's unfortunately the reality of the 21st century, is that people that have wealth, they can move their wealth wherever they want. So if the country that they're domiciled in creates a wealth tax, they can simply move their wealth to another country and not have to pay that tax. And I know what you might be thinking right now. You're thinking, oh, these sneaky rich people, they just evade these taxes. They jump on a plane and fly somewhere with all of their cash. And that is another myth that I think needs to be busted in Gary's argument, which is wealth is not cash in a briefcase. When I talk about people leaving these countries, when France reported that 70,000 millionaires left the country in 2017 after their wealth tax, it wasn't like 70,000 millionaires all got on planes with their gold bars and cash in briefcases. They stopped investing money into the economy. That might not look like anything. And I think that's the other dangerous thing here, is that when we think about wealth, the wealth is not in the form of cash. So if you were to put a 1% wealth tax on the wealthy, let's use that example. Everything above $1 million gets taxed 1%. That's not cash that rich people have in their bank account that they're just gonna wire. Of course, some wealthy people have cash, but my point is, what that's going to do is it's going to require wealthy people to sell off their assets. Those assets will include businesses, equities in stocks, and what that does is it impacts the real economy. And so in order to get that 1% wealth tax, you're not just taking cash out of their bank accounts, you're actually reducing the size of those businesses by 1%. And what that ends up doing is those businesses have to cut costs, and the largest expense for practically every business is its employees. And so people end up losing their jobs. And this is what a lot of people don't think about when it comes to a wealth tax. A wealth tax sounds all neat and tidy. You just take the wealth out of the bank account. But that's not how it works. And by the way, we covered this topic in depth in the 5 levels of investing series, particularly in level 1, where I talked about why you shouldn't save all of your money in cash and why wealthy people don't do that. Wealthy people put their wealth into assets that grow in value over time. And so mini interruption / relevant takeaway here is if you want to change your own circumstance, you should act more like the rich people. Take your money and invest it into assets that grow instead of leaving it in cash. Back to Gary's economics. Last but not least, I want to talk about the final problem I have with Gary's thesis, which again, I have not seen him talk about in the videos and interviews that I've watched of his, which is that once you acquire the tax, let's just assume that the wealth tax works in that you're able to actually tax 1% of the wealth of these rich people and it doesn't have a negative impact on the economy. I think it would, but let's just pretend that it doesn't have that negative impact. All right, we have this money. The problem with that is that the money is now in the hands of government. And the government has proven time and time and time again to not be efficient capital allocators. They are not good at taking money and then reinvesting it. So even if the wealth tax works and you're able to take that money from the wealthy people, you're now faced with the problem of how do you actually redistribute it in a way that helps poor people. And if we look at wealth inequality and we agree that wealth inequality is growing and that living standards have decreased, why is it that government spending has increased across that whole time? Because if government spending has been increasing, that means that the government has been getting more revenue, more tax. You would think that that would help solve wealth inequality. But it hasn't shown that. If the wealth tax were to work and you were to get that extra tax, there is no evidence that suggests that that would actually help poor people. It would somehow end up going through that government system and benefiting other rich people. And I think that's like a huge issue here. Even if you fully agree with the wealth tax and you disagree with me that the wealth tax can't be evaded and it wouldn't have a negative impact, you're still left with this massive problem, which is how do you actually allocate the money in an appropriate way? Which again takes us back to North Korea and the Soviet Union, which is where a lot of these socialist ideas seem really attractive on paper, but in execution, it becomes extremely difficult and they end up failing. In my opinion, I think there's a lot of economists that have written about this. The reason for this is that in a free market, in a vibrant economy where there's little interruption by the government, the economy is managed by all of the free market participants, which is millions of individuals making economic decisions every single day. But when you try to centralize that planning into the government, even if the government has 1,000 employees, 10,000 employees, that's still less mental horsepower and computing power than the entire economy at large. And so a centralized force trying to determine where to send resources to help the economy inevitably fails over time. I know this video is different than many of my others, and like I said, I don't enjoy making these types of videos. I would much prefer to just support all these creators that I see out there. And like I said, I love what Gary's doing from a content creator standpoint. I just really disagree with the economics that he's bringing to the table. And his channel is called Gary's Economics. So I thought that someone needed to make this video. An important disclaimer here, as I've talked about in videos in the past, economics is not a hard science. Economics is more like an art where there are different schools of thought. And so Gary has all the rights in the world to believe what he believes. And so do I. And so do you. You should use your own critical thinking, look at the different economic theories that are out there, and decide for yourself which of these schools of thought aligns best with my beliefs, and perhaps most importantly, which of these schools of thoughts empowers me to make better decisions in my life. And I know that Daniel in this debate got a lot of flack on Twitter from, more left-leaning people and Gary's audience by saying, you know what, everyone should just try to pull themselves up from the bootstraps, and you should become an entrepreneur, and you can take your wealth into your own hands. And that's a lot of what I talk about on this channel. I understand that not everyone can do that. Not everyone can become an entrepreneur. Not everyone wants to be an entrepreneur. But entrepreneurs are who create jobs for the people that don't want to be entrepreneurs. And with very few exceptions like government jobs, we all need to celebrate entrepreneurs, even if you aren't one, because it's entrepreneurs that will create wealth for the economy. I'm gonna leave you off with this final thing. And again, hopefully this empathizes with Gary as well as his audience. If anyone has watched this far and still thinks that Gary is right, Gary built a lot of his wealth through trading. And I'm not making any moral judgment on investment and trading and banking, but I think it's really important to point out that trading and the world of finance, working at a bank, is largely a zero-sum game, right? You are quite literally moving wealth from one person's pockets to another person's pockets. It reminds me of this classic scene from the movie Wall Street, not the new rendition, but the original movie with Charlie Sheen, where Gordon Gekko says exactly that. There's no such thing as enough. It's really just moving money from one person to another person. The reason that Gordon Gekko is a villain in that movie is because that is a warped worldview. The real world of entrepreneurship, like the world that Daniel built his wealth in, and ironically the world that Gary Stevenson finds himself in now as a YouTube channel creator and entrepreneur in his own right, entrepreneurs create new wealth through their businesses. It is not like trading where you are moving wealth from one person's pockets to another. And so I empathize with Gary because his whole adult life was spent in the trenches of a particularly zero-sum industry. And I can only hope and pray that through his business, through his YouTube channel, and through actually employing people, I think he mentions he has a small team now, he's going to learn about what entrepreneurship does for the economy and how it actually creates value, and that taxing and moving wealth from one person's pockets to another is not going to solve the core problems that exist in the UK economy, but also the global economy. At the end of the day, make up your own mind. Be a critical thinker. Don't take my word for it. Don't take Gary's word for it. He is a great speaker and communicator. I think that's why he's been so successful. But I hope that this video provides a different perspective on some of those same issues. And it shows that we can agree on things like wealth inequality being a problem, but disagree on the solutions. And yeah, that's it for today. I know it was a lot, but like I said, I felt like this video needed to be made. If you disagree, if you agree, as always, leave a comment. I read every single one and I try to respond to all of you. And let me know if there's other topics you'd like me to tackle around Gary's economics, around the economy at large. I'd love to hear from you, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.